All right, welcome, Scott.
A little palate cleanser of sorts, I guess.
Yeah, great
All
to
right.
great to have you here. I mean, first it would be great if you kick off and talk about what you've been working on at Adobe and more broadly around AI.
Sure. Well, I think my angle is a little bit more towards the implications for creativity and marketing.
Mm,
I think in both instances, there have been just really hard to achieve skill sets that drive both of those categories. They've also been functions that largely are different and oftentimes have all these people and tools in the middle, or agencies that work for agencies, and
mm,
it's pretty interesting. Fast forward to today, I think on the marketing side, we know that every brand needs to be able to think and act in real time in order to inject things in the social world at the right time and the right way, which means that marketers need to be able to be outfitted to make variations of stuff and just, essentially work with skills they don't have on the creative side. So that's one thing that AI is doing on the marketing side. We can get more into that.
mm.
And on the creator side, there is first of all, creators have always defined themselves by what category they're expert in.
Mm.
So I'm a graphic designer, or I'm an animator, I'm a motion graphics artist. And now, as every social platform where most marketing budgets are spent are multimedia, right? Every creative is expected to be able to work outside of their category. So AI is enabling them to do that. And also, as every brand floods the zone with infinite amounts of content, and we're all just like constantly being bombarded with more and more and more content, I think we're all going to crave as consumers content with more meaning, which means that creators need to find better stuff. And so I think that these tools are in some ways raising the bar for what they're capable of in terms of better content. So I think that's a macro of what I'm focused on with
Okay.
my day job.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Adobe obviously extremely well known for Photoshop and Premiere and a bunch of other creative tools. You guys have made a pretty big splash in the sort of last 18 to 24 months in this AI era around, I think, image generation tools in particular. And I would like to say sort of pioneered legal licensing of training data for your Firefly-based models. And I was fascinated in understanding from your perspective, like, how you guys saw what was happening with, I think, Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and other image generation tools like that, and you decided, hey, like, we know creators are going to want these tools. We know folks who use Photoshop and other Adobe products are going to want these tools, but we're going to differentiate by, from day one, really focusing on licensing all of our training data. And how you saw that kind of, I mean, it seems fairly prescient now, given there's obviously quite a lot of legal risk and debate, I think, in a lot of different creative areas. How did you guys decide to focus on that?
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, first of all, people have always dragged images into Photoshop, right?
Sure. Yep.
And we've never shut down the walls of what you can and can't drag into Photoshop, and we never will. That being said, when we were training our own models, we heard from two major constituents very strongly how we should do it, right? From the customers, they made it very clear that they're feeling at risk in this new world, and that the tools that they use need to be trusted and need to never, ever, ever train on their own data.
Okay.
So we made a commitment from day one. We're never going to train, obviously, on stuff on our cloud, but also we're never going to scrape the web with taking imagery or whatever else and just training on it. When we launched Firefly and people went and sort of hit it hard and said, Spider-Man, and then realized that it looked like a spider that looked like a man, but it wasn't Spider-Man, we got a lot of blowback. Like, what the hell? Like, look what happens on Midjourney, and then look what happens on Firefly. And I had to explain that's a feature, not a bug. It shows that we're not trained on IP off the open internet. And that's really been an important thing for our customers on the creator side. Now, also, though, on the agencies and big brands, they also said we would never use generative AI. And I was like, whoa, like, you first of all have to use it. So what do you mean? And they're like, well, we can never take the risk that any other company's IP or competitor's IP somehow creeps into an asset that we use for commercial purposes. And so we would always play it safe. Also, we don't know what the rules will be in the EU versus Australia versus US and how they'll change. Like, we never would want to use copyrighted material for, in the models that we use. And so for two reasons, right, it was very clear to us that Adobe is going to train its models. And, a lot of people don't say how their models are trained. It kind of goes quiet. When you ask that question, we've been very explicit. We train on stock content that is licensed by Adobe Stock, and we have a contribution or a compensation program for all of our stock artists. And so that's been our approach. But that being said, I'm sure there are third-party models that people are using today and will continue to use with our tools, like Runway and others. I mean, we want to have this ecosystem. We've always been a platform-agnostic company, and that certainly doesn't change.
Yeah, I was interested by the fact that you have other models in these tools as well. I mean, you mentioned you have Runway, I think, in Premiere, along with a number of other video generation tools alongside yours. Are you seeing that you guys are sort of falling behind on quality because it's trained on stock images, or do you see a balance between, okay, there's a certain customer that demands this really rigorous IP approach for either moral or business reasons, and then there's another customer that just doesn't care? Like, how are you seeing the balance and the uptake between the sort of, more principled, focused perspective on training versus, maybe it's not the best, or maybe it's not the most cutting edge, right?
Well, I think it matters, like, for what purpose, right?
Yeah.
So if you are a major brand that wants to make a custom model where you take all of your content that is licensed to you, obviously, and then you train a version of Firefly made with, say, every SpongeBob SquarePants piece of collateral ever made, make the SpongeBob SquarePants model, like, we're world class in that area.
Have they done that? Has SpongeBob done this?
I can't speak to SpongeBob, but a lot of characters. I mean,
are there any examples that have done
we
this?
work with, I think that might be an example. I don't know. We'll see. But there are a lot of entertainment companies, but a lot of brands. Have I'm trying to think of ones that publicly have come out and talked about this, but there are quite a number of them, and it's world class because they're getting a world class foundational model with no IP taint, custom trained on their own data. So a Nike shoe even looks more like a Nike shoe than it might be if you prompted it in Midjourney or somewhere else. But what we're not world class in is if you want to make the Pope in a Gucci jacket, because our model,
Balenciaga, right?
Balenciaga, even better, or Gucci.
It's important to have that.
I'm being creative here. I want to mix it up. But our model doesn't know what Gucci is, right? And I don't know if our model knows what the Pope is, or what exactly the Pope looks like, or this Pope. So, it just depends what your use case is. Now, there's a lot of brainstorming and mood boarding use cases in the creative world that would very legitimately maybe use a model that is trained on that IP. But that's not sort of our zone.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier the sort of difference between training and the sort of licensing of training data, and then the inference side of things, and the sort of, copying SpongeBob SquarePants versus training on SpongeBob SquarePants. I mean, I'm interested in your perspective there on the difference between, I guess the legal and moral issues around training on IP versus generating, I don't know, copycats or whatever you would want to call it.
Well, I should start by saying I'm not a lawyer.
Okay. Right.
But I have been super
neither.
interested in this. And one of the things that's fascinating about copyright law is that it was really developed to protect the economic detriment of someone who generates original content or
Creative
original IP. And so if you follow the logic, right, we're at this moment where I think our government and many governments are tied between two competing agendas, right? One is, I want America to be ahead in AI, and therefore we shouldn't deprive America of the training data that other countries might use to be ahead in AI. And at the same time, I want to protect the integrity of copyright, because I want creators to have an incentive to create, knowing that their economic interests are not going to just be ripped and used to their detriment. An obvious way to potentially do this might be to say, there's new legislation that updates copyright law. You shouldn't be able to impersonate someone's style without compensating them. So if you are on Behance, the company that I originally founded, and we have 50 million profiles, and some of them are super, super deep, consistent styles over someone's career that they are hired to do for the best brands in the world. And right now, you'll go to some products like Midjourney, you'll see people literally prompting with their name, which makes it clear where that training data came from.
Yeah.
And those people are not getting any compensation. Well, if you prompt with someone's name to purposely rip their style instead of paying them to do their work, in my opinion, that should not be legal. That should be something where the creator can go and fight and get paid for their work. However, should you be able to train generalized models, and as long as you have the safeguards in place, I think that what we're seeing with LLMs is there's just no way to do it other than that. And so, I don't know how copyright law will evolve, but what I do know is it's severely outdated.
Interesting. I mean, so pivoting, I think, to a different direction, given your experience with startup investing and advising and starting some companies yourself, we heard earlier from Pat Grady at Sequoia, there's sort of the classic startup conundrum is, can we can we, with the good technology, figure out distribution before the distribution company figures out the technology? Now, you today work at Adobe, probably like the canonical distribution company example in the creative tools space. I'm interested, like, A, do you feel like you guys, can hang in there with the up-and-coming startups? And then B, are there interesting startups you're seeing that are either in the creative space or maybe in other areas where you do think they have a good chance at beating the incumbent or beating the person with a lot of distribution?
Yeah, listen, so it's a great question, and I think the way I honestly assess this is it starts with the customer's workflow, right?
Okay.
And it actually ends with the customer's workflow. When you bring a AI-powered capability to their workflow, like exactly where they need it at their fingertips, then they stay. If you make that available as a point product somewhere else, or a startup makes it available, they leave, or they at least adapt their workflow to accommodate this new product.
Mm-hmm.
In some instances, we want to just integrate, right? Because we're not going to build every model in the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's, my forecast is there's going to be thousands of long tail, super capable models that do one particular thing extraordinarily well. I'm actually more excited about that than I am about these massive multimodal LLMs that are emerging with billions and billions of dollars behind them,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that the orchestration layer of these super capable models is really where it's at. And I don't think we're going to build all of them, nor should we. So we're trying to make sure that we incorporate the greatest models wherever they might be and make it easy to access from the workflow.
Mm-hmm.
If I were a startup, what I'd be focused on is areas that would be really hard for an incumbent to incorporate into their workflow, or net new workflows that didn't even exist.
Yeah.
In industries that it's always been antiquated and people heavy, and there's just no great end-to-end software solution that would bring an LLM in and suddenly make it better.
Yeah. So do you have examples of startups in areas that you like for either creative tools or other areas?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a fun space emerging of what's also interesting is that a lot of these startups have new business models.
Okay.
I'm seeing very few startups with like SaaS seat-based business models.
Okay.
Which is really what was all we saw for like a decade.
Mm-hmm.
Now oftentimes you're either paying for impact or outcome, or you're paying for an AI teammate, right? So one example is some startups like 11x that are doing sales development representatives as an AI teammate.
Okay.
And they market a product called Alice, right? And when you get Alice on your team, she sources magically all of these leads for people, on your team, the salespeople, to have ultimately yield invites on their calendar. And so they can just start to, instead of that very human and annoying thing of getting into people's DMs on LinkedIn and whatever, you can sort of start with a meeting. Another example on the other end of the spectrum, is a company that I'm an investor in called Kobold, and they're AI for mineral excavation. And if you think about
mineral excavation.
yeah, so like mineral identification and excavation. So like
digging minerals out of the ground.
finding,
Okay.
identifying, and increasing the yield of mining operations.
Okay.
But the more I learned about it, the more I realized it's a very people-intensive, like kind of old geologist group
Okay.
practice that is, somewhat witchcraft. It's like, I think this is the area, and then it's like, let's take 3 years to do an excavation and determine whether I'm right or not.
Okay.
And there's just such an opportunity, right, for new workflows that are AI-based and something like that.
Okay.
2 examples.
I mean, the mineral excavation one's pretty fascinating. Do they have some training data set of like where all the minerals have ever been discovered and built off that, or?
Yeah, it's like they have many different models working in
Okay.
tandem that leverage whether it's geospatial type of imagery for data or past mineral excavation, yield data, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay. Wow, this is fascinating. Gotta check out the mineral excavation space. You're ahead of the game there. I'm interested, we just talked to Runway, and I think you've seen a lot of different creative tools in the space. Like, what do you think is the sort of like, breakout new type of creative tool of this cycle, of the AI cycle, right? I mean, in the history of PCs, I think, Photoshop was sort of the iconic creative tool of the 80s and the Macintosh and everything, Is there a new type of content or just a new type of interface you're seeing in creative tools that you think is enabled by large language models and image generation that was just not possible 2 years ago, let's say, or 5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, well, I love this question, and I feel I don't have a perfect example to cite, but I will tell you,
But like a space.
I'll tell you the space is missing.
Okay.
And admittedly, I want to capture it with my
At
team.
Adobe, yeah. Okay.
But I want competition so we can find the best solution ultimately. But here's the problem statement. is that our customers, and any customers of creative tools have spent all of their time historically deep into the tool and the refinement and production process. Endless nights, in a product like Photoshop, applying marching ants or masking and managing layers and like all of this stuff, right? Now a lot of that has been offloaded, that productivity work, that mundane repetitive work has been offloaded to compute. And creators now have more time. So what do they need to do with their time? They need to find better solutions to stand out in this world where every brand's flooding the zone and content needs to have more meaning and power to it, right? And so what you're seeing is the time that used to be spent in the refinement tooling mode is being shifted up the funnel towards the exploration and ideation space.
Okay.
So what that means is, instead of finding like one or two ideas and paths, and then as a designer spending the next week pursuing those two paths to two options for my client, instead I can spend maybe 50% more time in the ideation explorations phase. I can explore 50 or 500 ideas and find the best 4, and then go into the refinement zone and use AI to be more proficient.
Interesting.
So that tooling is actually, I think, more AI-based. I think it's mood boarding, ideation driven. So it's maybe not actually, I don't know what you call it. It's also like art direction and taste driven. I think one of the more controversial things I mistakenly said that people were kind of questioning was this notion of like taste becoming more important than skill, which is like a sacrilegious thing to say when you're, making tools where people are proud of the years they've spent to develop skills. But I believe it. I feel like taste will ultimately be the differentiator. And I think taste development tools like I'm describing need to exist.
That's fascinating. So you think more options at the sort of top of funnel from a creative perspective, and hopefully yielding more creative results in the end, because it takes less time to make things.
And so think about examples. Like if I have images that I love that I captured in bookmarks on Instagram, and I want to make sketches and I want to create color palettes, and then I want to mash them all together, literally drag them into one another, and then generate this new asset. And then make 30 variations of that, pick the one that I like out of my taste, make that, use that as a mood board or whatever, a source of color palette or whatever. Like that's the thing that I think our customers want to do.
Yeah. So for my last topic, I guess, you wrote a book called The Messy Middle, which was sort of about the hard parts of running a startup. And I'm sort of interested in like what you see as the messy middle. We've got a lot of startup founders here, some seed, some mid-stage, some growth IPO. Like, what have you found in working with startups, starting your own company, to be that kind of like the toughest part of that experience, and how can you help people get through it, or how can they get through it by maybe reading your book or listening to this talk?
I'll give you the TLDR.
Yeah.
No one who reads books anymore.
Show your books, yeah.
No, I think listen, I feel during a Cambrian explosion of sorts, like we're in right now.
Feels like
where,
a big one.
It's funny. I mean, a lot of teams, small and big, take a lot of pride in having a very declared strategy that basically sticks for years. And I think in most instances that works. But when you're in platform shifts and the strategy is inherently changing constantly because OpenAI announces something and then Meta announces something and then we realize that they did this, and everyone's sort of constantly triangulating. First of all, I think you have to lead with adaptability. You also need to like merchandise the narrative to your team to help them like survive the churn.
Got it.
So to me, like you're asking like one important thing to consider at this moment is the fact that all of you who are building teams right now in this time of change and volatility, you are essentially driving your team across country in a car with the windows blacked out in the back seat. And people will go stir crazy and start to doubt and get out of the car unless you are constantly merchandising the progress you're making to your team. So, it's like we just crossed the bridge. Oh, we're in some traffic now. Oh, I'm making a U-turn, but don't worry, I know where we're going. Like, it sounds silly, but this merchandising of progress, there is a lot of research, by the way, around like progress begets progress and motivation. And this woman, Teresa Mabile, who wrote a lot of did a lot of research on this. So we have to narrate that progress and merchandise that progress to our team in order for them to stick with it long enough to figure it out, which is, by the way, one of the probably greatest competitive advantages of any startup is simply sticking together.
So be more adaptable, basically, in this changeable era.
Yeah, try.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott Belsky.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.